Chapter 5. Explosion. As usual, Anatoli Diatlov, a 55-year-old deputy chief engineer of the Chernobyl power plant, reached his workplace on foot. A tall, well-built man with a broad open face and silver-grey hair and moustache, he cared about keeping fit, and the walk to the station from his apartment building on Lenin Boulevard and back was part of his daily routine. He calculated that by walking 4 kilometers each way, he covered close to 200 kilometers per month. Along with all the fast walking he did at the plant from one reactor to another, and then within the units themselves, that added up to 300 kilometers per month, sufficient exercise, in his opinion, to keep him in good physical form. He found his daily walks good for his mental balance. Walking, you clear your mind of all unpleasant thoughts. And if something does find its way into your head, speed up, he wrote later. On the night of April the 25th, his walk was like any other. No untoward thoughts entered his head. At least he did not remember any later. Everything seemed normal and under control. The shutdown schedule had been slightly adjusted, but that was nothing to worry about. It had happened before. Like everyone else in Pripyat, he was looking forward to the weekend, relaxing with his family, which did not see much of him during the week, and spending some time with his granddaughter. A lover of classic Russian poetry who could recite entire poems by Alexander Blok and Sergei Yesenin by heart, he planned to spend at least part of the weekend with a book in his hands. But first he had a task to complete. When it came to the plant's senior management, the shutdown of Unit 4, planned for that day, was mainly his responsibility. Diatlov was one of the top nuclear experts at the plant, and an early arrival in Pripyat. He had come to the city in September 1973, at the age of 42. Born in Siberia, he had studied in Norilsk, in the far north, and at the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute, MIFI, the Soviet Union's leading school for nuclear physicists, engineers, and practitioners in other technological fields. For more than a decade, Diatlov had worked at the shipbuilding yard in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, a Far Eastern industrial city of more than 200,000, where he headed the group that tested nuclear reactors designed for Soviet submarines. He decided to change jobs after he and his family got tired of his regular tours of duty on nuclear submarines, where he installed and tested nuclear engines. While Diatlov had no previous experience of working on powerful reactors like the ones designed for the Chernobyl power station, he had no problem training himself on the job. He would later bring quite a few of his colleagues from Komsomolsk-on-Amur to work at the Chernobyl station. In Pripyat, Diatlov rose through the ranks from deputy chief of the reactor group to deputy chief engineer. He received 2 high state awards for good work. With Nikolai Fomin injured in a car crash, some believed that Diatlov had a good chance of replacing him in the chief engineer's office. Many thought that would be a good thing. Both the director of the plant, Viktor Brukhanov, and its chief engineer, Fomin, had come to Pripyat from conventional thermal plants that ran on coal, and neither was an expert on nuclear power. Diatlov was. In fact, he was the highest-ranking nuclear power expert at the plant, and he was responsible for the operation of the reactors, including launches and shutdowns. With reactors, as with airplanes, takeoff and landing are the most challenging moments. Diatlov had to be there for the shutdown of Unit 4 to see that everything went according to the program. There would also be a turbine test which had been approved the previous day by Diatlov's boss, Nikolai Fomin. Preparations had begun in March, but it was not until mid-April that Fomin called a meeting of engineers from the plant and representatives of research units and consulting firms to discuss the procedures and establish a combined program for the tests. It was Diatlov who gave Vitaly Borets the task of coordinating the schedules. He was also the first to approve the proposed test programs and timetable. At the plant, Diatlov was known for being difficult, occasionally even rough. Diatlov was a complicated man to deal with, direct, with his own point of view that he never changed according to a superior's wish. He argued and did not agree. Ultimately he obeyed, but stood by his opinion, recalled one of his acquaintances. In just the same way he did not reckon very much with the views of subordinates. You understand that not everyone likes such a person. A more favourable assessment of Diatlov's management style came from another colleague. Diatlov would instantly chew out anyone who tried to deceive, to weasel out of fulfilling a task, to hide behind far-fetched explanations, or even worse, to conceal a violation of instructions. And then the punishment would fit the crime. Many reacted with anger and indignation while understanding the justness of the assessment in their hearts. If Diatlov was a strict disciplinarian, he was also good at getting things done, the quality most valued by his bosses. His argumentative nature and his subordinates' complaints about his occasional rudeness could be brushed aside. Those who knew Diatlov appreciated his sense of humour. He had a wonderful memory, and could memorize whole pages not only of poetry, but also of technical instructions. In his line of work that was a valuable asset. On the night of April the 25th, Diatlov clearly took his time. With the power plant only a few kilometers away from his apartment building, and Diatlov himself in good physical shape, Yuri Trehub estimated that it shouldn't have taken him longer than 40 or 50 minutes to reach Unit 4. Trehub had called Diatlov's apartment around 9 p.m. and learned that he had already left. But now it was well past 10 p.m., when the operator of the Kiev power grid had given permission to shut down the reactor, yet Diatlov was nowhere in sight. It was only around 11 p.m. that colleagues called Trehub from the neighbouring Unit 3 to inform him that Diatlov was there. He stopped off at Unit 3 on his way and evidently found something wrong with regard to discipline. He dressed them down, remembered Trehub. That was typical of Diatlov. He punished personnel severely for mistakes and disobedience, bellowing at them and fraying nerves, recalled another colleague. But Diatlov was in no hurry. He had delayed his arrival for one simple reason. When the request from the power grid operator earlier in the day had held up preparations for the reactor shutdown, he had asked Hennady Metlenko, the head of the group from Donetsk, conducting the turbine test, to check with the unit shift at 10:30 p.m. to see whether the test could proceed. It would take the consultants at least half an hour to reach the unit, so there was no point in rushing to get there before 11 p.m. When Diatlov showed up in the control room of Unit 4, it was already after that, and the consultants, led by Metlenko, came in a few minutes later. They could finally start. Trehub had a number of questions about the shutdown procedure, but Diatlov refused to discuss them. Trehub understood that Diatlov had already decided to conduct the turbine test on the next shift, which made good sense. At 11:10 p.m., Trehub began to reduce the power level of the reactor. Then at 1,600 megawatts of thermal energy. By midnight, the official end of his shift, the level was down to 760 megawatts of thermal energy, as prescribed by the program for the turbine test. The new shift that took over from Yuri Trehub was headed by Alexander Akimov, a 33-year-old engineer with 10 years of experience at the Chernobyl plant. Bespectacled and sporting a fashionable moustache, Akimov was regarded as competent, friendly, and susceptible to pressure from the higher-ups. A member of Pripyat's Communist Party committee, he was clearly on his way up. He had been appointed head of shift only 4 months earlier. Also new on the job was the 25-year-old Leonid Toptunov. Like Akimov, he was nearsighted, wore glasses, and had a moustache. It was Toptunov's 3rd month as senior engineer in charge of the reactor's operational regimen, a demanding job of operating dozens of switches and tumblers. An extra worker was added to do that job during the first days after the engineers in charge of reactors returned from their vacations. Otherwise, quipped Trehub, who had performed that function earlier, it would be like expecting a pianist to perform without rehearsals. Other members of the shift, engineers responsible for the operation of the unit and the turbines, had more experience in their respective positions. Akimov and his crew had worked the previous night shift, and it was on their watch that the slowing down of the reactor had begun in the early hours of April the 25th. By the time they arrived for the new shift, the process of shutting down the reactor was supposed to be complete, and they expected a relatively peaceful period of watching over a reactor that had been stopped earlier in the day by more experienced crews. But now the task of shutting down the reactor was being passed back to them. Akimov, who had arrived half an hour before the start of his shift, was trying to figure out what he had to do. Shutting down a reactor was a difficult task, and the handover of responsibility was rushed. The control room was full of people, old shift, new shift, managers and engineers from other divisions who were involved in the turbine test, or who simply wanted to see how their equipment behaved during the shutdown. Altogether, up to 20 people. Trehub had had some time to figure out how the shutdown and test program should work, but Akimov had none. Akimov sat next to Trehub, who explained to him what he had figured out about the test program. He had been studying it for most of his shift, but some questions remained unanswered, such as what to do with the power produced by the reactor once the supply of boiling water and steam was cut off from the turbine. Diatlov had not been interested in discussing that matter with Trehub, so Trehub simply offered Akimov what he believed to be the best solution. Trehub stayed on for the next shift, but only as an observer, since he was interested in seeing how the test would go. Akimov was now formally in charge of the control room, while informal authority was held by Diatlov, the senior person in the room, who immediately reminded everyone of that. Razim Davletbayev, the deputy chief of the plant's turbine unit, was in the control room that night too. He recalled, immediately upon the start of the shift, Diatlov began demanding that the program continue to be carried out. When Akimov sat down to study the program, Diatlov began reproaching him for working too slowly and failing to pay attention to the complexity of the situation that had arisen in the unit. Diatlov shouted at Akimov to get up, and started insisting that he hurry up. Akimov, holding a sheaf of papers in his hands, evidently the program, began going around to the control room operators and establishing whether the equipment was in appropriate condition for the program that was being carried out. They started the shutdown. By that time, the reactor's power level had been reduced from 1,600 megawatts of thermal energy to 520 megawatts of thermal energy. Following the program, Leonid Toptunov continued gradually reducing power output by inserting control rods into the core of the reactor. The deeper the rods penetrated, the more neutrons they neutralized, and the slower the reaction would become. Everything went as planned until an emergency signal indicated that the supply of water to the reactor had dropped to an unacceptably low level. Yuri Trehub, who saw the emergency light go on, rushed to help Toptunov. Toptunov was confused and did not call technicians to check whether the signal was correct and whether he should open the valve to increase the supply of water. Trehub did that instead. He began switching tumblers to check the water level when suddenly he heard Akimov's voice, "Keep up the power!" He looked at the indicators on the control panel and realized that the power level of the reactor was rapidly falling. It turned out that when Toptunov switched from one regulator of the control rods to another, which turned out to be out of order, he caused a sudden reduction of the power level, bringing the reactor near to shutdown long before the test had been completed. At 28 minutes past midnight on April the 26th, the reactor's computer recorded the level falling to 30 megawatts of thermal energy, a huge drop, given that it had begun descending at a level close to 520 megawatts of thermal energy. According to one eyewitness, the power level dropped to almost zero. With Akimov's assistance, Toptunov switched off the automatic system controlling the rods and began withdrawing them manually to breathe life back into the dying reactor. Trehub was also there to help. "Why are you withdrawing the control rods inconsistently? This is where you should be withdrawing," he told Toptunov, who was initially taking them out of some sectors of the reactor, but not from others. Trehub eventually replaced Toptunov at his workstation and brought the power level up to keep the reactor going. In 4 minutes, they raised the level from 30 megawatts of thermal energy to 160 megawatts of thermal energy. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. That moment of keeping up the power level was somewhat nerve-wracking, remembered Trehub. As soon as we got up to a level of 200 megawatts of thermal energy and switched to automatic, everything settled down. The question was what to do next. Shut down the reactor in orderly fashion, or raise the power to a level at which the test could continue. If the reactor was shut down, then the turbine test, so long in preparation, would have to be abandoned. No one wanted that. Diatlov, who had left the control room when the loss of power took place, was now back, and, as he later recalled, he gave his permission to raise the power level. Those in the control room saw him wiping sweat off his brow. Trehub remembered him in discussion with Akimov, who, with papers in hand, apparently was trying to convince Diatlov of something. Trehub overheard Diatlov demanding that the power level be kept at 200 megawatts of thermal energy. That was much lower than the 760 megawatts of thermal energy prescribed for conducting the test, and deviation from the specified test parameter could spell disaster. But at 200 megawatts of thermal energy, they thought they could stabilize the reactor and start the test. Whether Diatlov suggested that level first and then ordered Akimov and Toptunov to attain it, or simply accepted their proposal, remains a mystery. But he never denied that he approved conducting the test at that power level. Since he was the senior official in the control room, everyone followed his orders. Diatlov was determined to go ahead with the test. Those present in the control room remember him urging people to hurry up. At 43 minutes after midnight, he ordered the operators to block the emergency signal from the 2 steam turbines that would be involved in the test. 20 minutes later, at 1:03 a.m., in order to increase the flow of water through the reactor, they activated one of the 2 reserve pumps, then another one 4 minutes later. It was all part of the test program, but given the reactor's low power level, the addition of 2 pumps to the 6 already in operation further destabilized the reactor. Additional pumps increased the flow of water and decreased the amount of steam in the steam-water separator drums. The power level took another hit. Water, unlike steam, absorbs neutrons and slows down the rate of nuclear reactions. At 1:19 a.m., the low steam pressure alarm sounded. The operators switched off the alarm and shut down the reserve pumps. Keeping the reactor going at the low power level of 200 megawatts of thermal energy turned out to be a problem that became ever more difficult to solve as they moved closer to the moment when they could begin the test. The power level kept falling. The rapid decline of the power level earlier that morning and the reactor's continuing operation at a level of 200 megawatts of thermal energy or less caused a rapid accumulation in the fuel rods of xenon-135, a byproduct of nuclear fission that slowed down or poisoned the reaction by absorbing neutrons. To keep the power levels from falling further, Toptunov had to keep removing control rods from the active zone of the reactor. Numerous emergency signals indicating the unstable state of the reactor were ignored. Soon, only 9 rods out of close to 167 available remained in the core of the reactor. All the rest had been withdrawn, making the reaction difficult to control and the reactor highly unstable. Then, at 1:22 a.m., the computer system indicated that the reaction rate had begun to pick up, yet another uncontrolled factor. The water in the cooling system, with only 4 pumps operating, reached boiling point and turned into steam, drastically reducing the ability of the water, acting as a coolant, to absorb neutrons. Less water and more steam meant more unabsorbed neutrons and a spike in the intensity of the reaction. Toptunov read the computer data and reported it to Akimov. The power level was rising at an alarming speed, but Akimov was wholly focused on the logistics of the turbine test, which was supposed to start in a few seconds. Razim Davletbaev, the deputy head of the turbine division, who was in the control room, recalled that the head of the shift in Unit 4, Alexander Fedorovich Akimov, went up to every operator, among them the senior engineer in charge of turbines, Igor Kirschenbaum, whom he briefly instructed that after the command was given to start the test, he should shut off the steam on turbine 8. Then Akimov asked the operators to get ready, after which the test representative of the Dontechenergo enterprise, Metlenko, gave the command, "Attention, oscillograph start." It was 1:23 4 a.m. After that command, continued Davletbaev, Kirschenbaum closed the stop valves of the turbine, while I stood next to him and watched the tachometer monitoring the speed of turbine 8. As was to be expected, its speed fell sharply as a result of the electrodynamic braking of the generator. When the speed of the turbo generator had been reduced to the level specified in the test program, the generator started up again, that is, the coasting down segment of the test program worked properly, and we heard the command of the shift leader, Akimov, to shut down the reactor, which was done by the operator of the unit's control panel. The time was 1:23 40 a.m. The test had lasted 36 seconds. Those seconds turned out to be crucial for the fate of the reactor and the people in the control room of Unit 4. The power level of the reactor was out of control. The situation was worsened by the growing number of steam voids in the water coolant, which was now failing to absorb neutrons, and the lack of control rods in the active zone of the reactor, which had been removed in an attempt to revive the reaction. The automatic control system was trying to reduce the speed of the reaction with its 12 rods, but the rest of the rods had been withdrawn manually and remained out of the active zone. Toptunov, who had access to the computer data, shouted that the power level was rapidly rising. Diatlov later remembered that at the end of the test he heard the voices of Akimov and Toptunov. I was about 10 meters away from them and did not hear what Toptunov said, wrote a deputy chief engineer in his memoirs. Sasha Akimov ordered a shutdown of the reactor and pointed with his finger. "Press the button." The button that Akimov ordered Toptunov to press was AZ5, the one used for scram or emergency shutdown of the reactor. Toptunov removed the paper cover from the button and pressed it. Diatlov and the rest of the crew in the control room could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The difficult test was over. The red AZ5 button was supposed to do its job and shut down the reactor. It was an unusual measure, but this was an emergency. Once the button was pressed, 178 control rods began to move in the active zone of the reactor. They were 7 meters long, moved at a speed of 40 centimeters per second, and were made of boron, which absorbed neutrons and reduced the rate of the reaction. The tips of the rods, however, were made of graphite, and the graphite tips appear to have tipped the already highly unstable reactor toward catastrophe. As the rods began to descend into the core of the reactor, the tips replaced neutron-absorbing water in the top part of the active zone, thus not decreasing, but further increasing the rate of the reaction. This was the positive void effect, the deadly design problem of RBMK reactors that had almost destroyed one of them at the Leningrad power station in 1975. Now the positive void effect was once again at work. The introduction of the control rods with their graphite tips caused a spike in the level of the reaction and a dramatic rise of the core's temperature. The rise in temperature, in turn, caused the cladding of the fuel rods to fracture. These tubes, less than 14 millimeters, or approximately half an inch in diameter, have zircaloy walls, less than 1 millimeter or 0.04 inches thick, making them thinner than a strand of hair. The fractured fuel rods jammed the control rods, which by that time had been inserted to only 1/3 of their length. The core and the bottom of the reactor's active zone remained out of reach of the rods, and the reaction there spun completely out of control. The power output of the reactor, which had hovered around 200 megawatts of thermal energy, jumped to more than 500 megawatts of thermal energy within a few seconds, and then shot up to more than 30,000 megawatts of thermal energy, 10 times the norm. The rapidly increasing number of unabsorbed neutrons had burned away the xenon-135 that had been preventing the reactor from picking up speed a few minutes earlier. Now there was nothing to slow down the nuclear reaction. The fuel rods disintegrated, and the uranium fuel tablets in the zircaloy tubes of the fuel rods were released into the water of the cooling system, causing an enormous spike in the production of steam which had nowhere to go. Those in the control room heard a sudden roar. That roar was of a completely unfamiliar kind, very low in tone, like a human moan. Remembered Razim Davletbaev. For Yuri Trehub, it was at first as if a Volga automobile proceeding at full speed had started to brake and began to skid. It sounded like do-do-do-do. Trehub then heard a roar like the one described by Davletbaev. After that came the shocks, but not as in an earthquake, remembered Trehub. If you counted 10 seconds, there came a roar, and the frequency of the shocks diminished, but their strength increased. Then came the sound of the blast. Those were the effects of the steam explosion that destroyed the casing of the reactor, throwing the concrete plate, the upper biological shield of the reactor that the operators called Elena, which weighed 200 tons, through the roof of Unit 4 and into the air. The plate, to which the entire infrastructure of the reactor was fastened, landed back on top of the reactor, but did not cover it completely, leaving an opening through which it could freely spit radiation into the atmosphere. The time was 1:23 and 44 seconds a.m. 2 seconds later, the operators heard another, much more powerful blast. The floor and walls shook violently, dust and bits of debris fell from the ceiling, the luminescent lighting went off, semi-darkness descended, and only emergency lighting was on, recalled Davletbaev. Those inside the control room heard and felt the explosions, but did not know what had happened. An exploding reactor was the last thing on their minds. It was a difficult shift, and numerous alarms were going off, but such things had happened before. If something was going wrong, it could only be the cooling system or the steam turbine, not the reactor. As far as they were concerned, the reactor and its panoply of safety systems were idiot-proof. No textbook they had ever read suggested that reactors could explode. Everyone was in shock, recalled Trehub, describing the scene after electricity was restored in the control room. Everyone stood around with long faces. I was very frightened. Complete shock. They thought there had been an earthquake. It took them a while to realize that it was a man-made earthquake, one that they themselves had produced. The first blast was caused by the steam explosion, as the excess steam produced by the breaking of the fuel channels escaped into the external cooling system, detonating it. That explosion blew the Elena biological shield into the air, further damaging the fuel channels and tearing off the coolant lines attached to the shield. Without water to cool the active zone, the thermal power of the damaged reactor increased even more, causing a second, even more powerful explosion. The second blast destroyed a good part of the containment building and threw graphite blocks into the air. The moderator core of the reactor, along with part of its fuel. The highly radioactive pieces of graphite landed on the roof of the neighboring Unit 3 and were scattered all over the land on which the power plant was built. The graphite also caught fire inside the damaged reactor, sending radioactive particles high into the sky. The first to see what had happened were the scores of men who were fishing in the cooling pond of the power station on that warm April night. the pond that was used to breed fish and served as proof of the safety of the power plant. Two of the fishermen were very close to Unit 4, a mere 260 meters from the turbine hall. Suddenly they heard the dull sounds of the explosions, one and then the other. The ground shook under their feet, and the flames following the explosion suddenly illuminated the area, betraying their location. But no one came out to investigate. As fire rose higher and higher from the ruins of the reactor, they kept on fishing. They were hardly in a position to appreciate the significance of what they had witnessed. A nuclear star had fallen onto the earth, poisoning the land and water nearby, their catch, and the two fishermen themselves. They saw everything but realized nothing. They were the first, but not the last, to fail to grasp the reality.